Spider-Man: Brand New Day is reportedly sitting at a staggering $1.7 billion worldwide, and that number has put an uncomfortable spotlight on Supergirl. Because while Marvel and Sony are celebrating one of the biggest superhero box office runs in recent memory, DC Studios is still trying to explain why its own female-led superhero movie fell so far short of expectations. And now James Gunn appears to be pushing back against the comparison itself, arguing that Spider-Man and Supergirl simply cannot be judged by the same standards. But here's the problem. Audiences are already making that comparison, and the harder Gunn tries to separate these two movies, the more attention it brings to the enormous difference between their theatrical performances. So today, we're breaking down exactly what Gunn said, why the Spider-Man comparison is becoming such a problem for DC, and what this could mean for the future of the DCU. And if you enjoy straightforward Hollywood and DC commentary, make sure you subscribe to The Woke Watch, because there's a lot more coming. Welcome back to The Woke Watch. As of August 12th, 2026, the conversation around Spider-Man. Brand New Day and Supergirl has become impossible to ignore. On one side, you have Spider-Man. Brand New Day continuing an extraordinary theatrical run, with the movie reportedly reaching approximately $1.7 billion worldwide and potentially having even more room to grow. On the other side, you have Supergirl, a movie that entered theaters with enormous expectations as one of the major projects intended to establish the next phase of the DC universe, only to experience a dramatically weaker box office performance. And now that the difference between these two films has become so obvious, the response from DC Studios is getting increasingly defensive. James Gunn, David Zaslav, Millie Alcock, Anna Nogueira, and others connected to Supergirl have all faced questions about the movie's performance and what went wrong. But instead of embracing the comparison, Gunn is now arguing that audiences shouldn't be comparing Supergirl to Spider-Man at all. And that's where things get interesting, because whether DC Studios likes the comparison or not, audiences naturally compare major superhero releases. If one superhero movie is generating massive box office numbers while another struggles to attract moviegoers, people are obviously going to ask why. So what exactly did James Gunn say? According to the comments being circulated, Gunn argued that fandom culture has created an unfair comparison between the two films. He essentially suggested that people are using Spider-Man's success as evidence that Supergirl failed, when in his view, the circumstances surrounding both movies are completely different. Gunn acknowledged that Supergirl did not reach the theatrical projections the studio wanted, but he argued that this doesn't necessarily mean the movie itself was a failure. He also pointed toward the enormous popularity of Spider-Man and suggested that the character had unique advantages going into this release. From Gunn's perspective, Spider-Man had been away from solo theatrical adventures for several years, creating enormous anticipation among audiences. Supergirl, meanwhile, was being introduced as part of a relatively new DCU era that was still trying to establish itself. And Gunn believes those circumstances make a direct financial comparison unfair. But he went even further. He argued that part of Supergirl's struggle came from what he described as sexist and misogynistic reactions toward female protagonists. Gunn has repeatedly made the argument that criticism surrounding the film was influenced by hostility toward women in superhero stories, and he again pointed toward the backlash directed at Millie Alcock and Anna Nogueira. He also claimed that the harassment surrounding the movie contributed to negative word of mouth and made an already difficult theatrical situation even worse. And then came perhaps the most controversial part of his argument. Gunn suggested that Spider-Man's demographic appeal gives it a significant advantage, essentially arguing that a traditionally male-oriented superhero property can attract a different audience than a movie centered around a female superhero. He wasn't necessarily saying that Spider-Man is inherently a better character than Supergirl. Instead, his argument was that the two properties operate in completely different commercial environments. And according to Gunn, that makes it unreasonable to look at Spider-Man's box office success and immediately use it as proof that DC Studios handled Supergirl badly. But here's where I think the argument starts falling apart, because nobody is saying that Spider-Man and Supergirl are identical movies. Of course they're different. They have different characters, different histories, different fan bases, different marketing campaigns, and completely different positions within their respective cinematic universes, but that doesn't mean audiences aren't allowed to compare the results. And there's another question that needs to be asked. What if the biggest difference between these movies isn't gender at all, but simply audience satisfaction? Because Spider-Man: Brand New Day appears to be giving moviegoers something they actually want to experience in theaters. It's entertaining, it's accessible, it's built around an enormously recognizable character, and most importantly, audiences are talking about it and recommending it to other people. That's how positive word of mouth works. A movie doesn't necessarily need to reinvent cinema to become a blockbuster. Sometimes audiences simply want to have fun, and that's one of the biggest criticisms surrounding Supergirl. Critics of the film have argued that it struggled to create that same sense of excitement, with complaints ranging from the screenplay and pacing to the overall tone and characterization. Instead of leaving theaters excited to tell their friends to watch it, many viewers walked away questioning the creative decisions behind the movie. That's a major difference. And I'm not saying Spider-Man: Brand New Day is flawless. Far from it. One criticism that has already been raised is that the movie can feel almost like two different stories combined into one, particularly once the story reaches its midpoint and certain major developments change the direction and tone. That's a legitimate criticism to discuss, but there's an important distinction here. A movie can have flaws and still be incredibly entertaining, and that's something the box office can reveal. Audiences don't require a movie to be perfect before they're willing to spend money on it. They need a reason to care. They need a reason to leave the house, buy the ticket, and recommend the movie afterward. And right now, Spider-Man appears to have found that formula. That's why the $1.7 billion figure is so important to this conversation. If the movie continues performing at its current pace, crossing the $2 billion mark becomes a very realistic possibility, with even higher numbers potentially entering the conversation if momentum remains strong. And that creates a very uncomfortable contrast for DC Studios. Because for years, we've heard the superhero genre is becoming oversaturated. We've heard audiences are experiencing superhero fatigue. We've heard that people are simply losing interest in comic book movies. But Spider-Man's performance raises a much more complicated question. Are audiences really tired of superhero movies, or are they tired of superhero movies that don't give them a compelling reason to watch? There's a huge difference between those two things. If audiences were completely finished with superheroes, a movie like Spider-Man: Brand New Day shouldn't be performing at this level. Instead, we're seeing enormous demand for a superhero character when the project connects with audiences. And that suggests the problem isn't necessarily the genre itself. It may be the execution. We've seen other superhero movies struggle at the box office in recent years, and there are plenty of examples where audiences simply weren't interested enough to show up. But when a superhero movie delivers something audiences genuinely enjoy, the genre can still explode. That's why Spider-Man's success is potentially more significant for the entire industry than just another impressive box office statistic. It challenges the idea that superhero fatigue automatically explains every disappointing release. And that's exactly why the comparison is becoming uncomfortable for DC Studios. Because if Spider-Man continues toward $2 billion or beyond, people are naturally going to ask, why did audiences show up for the superhero movie but not Supergirl? James Gunn can argue that the comparison is unfair. Warner Brothers can emphasize the differences between the two properties. The filmmakers can point toward the harassment and online negativity surrounding Supergirl. But ultimately, audiences make their decision with their wallets. And there's another problem that makes this situation even more complicated for Gunn. The theatrical performance wasn't the only concern surrounding Supergirl. The movie also needed to find an audience after leaving theaters through digital platforms, and according to the narrative surrounding the film, those early digital results have not provided the dramatic turnaround DC Studios would have wanted. That leaves the upcoming streaming release as another major test. The question now becomes whether Supergirl can attract enough viewers on HBO Max to change the conversation. Could streaming give the movie a second life? Absolutely. Streaming audiences behave differently from theatrical audiences. People don't have to spend another $15, $20, or more to watch a movie they're curious about. If it's included with the subscription, clicking on it becomes a much easier decision. But that also creates another challenge. A streaming viewer can stop watching at any time. So Supergirl now has to prove that people aren't merely willing to click on it, they're actually willing to stay. And that brings us back to the larger issue facing James Gunn. Because while he's trying to explain why Supergirl shouldn't be compared to Spider-Man, the DCU itself is moving forward. Clayface is coming. Lanterns is coming. And Man of Tomorrow is another major project that will inevitably be judged against the expectations surrounding Gunn's new DC era. The success or failure of these upcoming projects won't be determined by Supergirl alone, but momentum matters, audience confidence matters, and perhaps most importantly, perception matters. If fans begin believing that the new DCU is repeating the same mistakes that hurt the previous era, Gunn will have an even bigger challenge ahead of him. That's why the Spider-Man comparison is more than just a social media argument. It's becoming a test of the larger question surrounding superhero cinema in 2026. Do audiences still want these movies? Spider-Man's numbers suggest they absolutely do. The real challenge for DC Studios is proving that audiences still want their version of them. And until that happens, every new major superhero success from Marvel or Sony is going to make the questions surrounding Supergirl and James Gunn's leadership even louder. So now I want to hear from you. Do you agree with James Gunn that Spider-Man, Brand New Day, and Supergirl shouldn't be compared, or do you think audiences are completely justified in looking at the two box office performances side by side? And more importantly, do you believe we're actually dealing with superhero fatigue, or simply bad superhero movie fatigue? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.